congratulations. And I believe the Prime Minister has also congratulated the Prime Minister of New Zealand. May I absolutely align myself with her remarks on the anniversary of Aberfan. It is something that will, I'm sure, be remembered. It was a great tragedy, and it was acted upon, and most coal tips were then removed for safety reasons. I also very much join her in sending best wishes to the honourable members for Chester and Bolton South East. The member for Bolton South East is an absolutely assiduous campaigner, and what she has done, the work she's done on Primados, is, I think, of fundamental importance. And I supported her very strongly from the backbenches, and I hope that she will soon be back to resume her effective campaigning and holding government to account. The Union Learning Fund, 1.4 billion on 12 million pounds. I mean, that sounds a little bit exaggerated. I think you can always find experts to come up with some figures if you ask them to. I think if they were getting that sort of return, they ought to be in investment management, my former profession, Mr. Speaker, rather than in a Union Learning Fund. As regards the Manchester issue, the government has provided £60 million of taxpayers' money, not £22 million, in Lancaster, Liverpool and South Yorkshire. Agreement was reached with the mayors, whereas in Manchester we had this ridiculous fandango with the mayor pretending he didn't know when he had been told by the Secretary of State, my right honourable friend for communities and local government, hours earlier. And it was as if he was trying to go on the stage. A most ridiculous, prancing performance that one could imagine when he should have been seriously trying to help the people of Manchester, which is what Her Majesty's government was doing. And I'm afraid he was playing party politics of the cheapest and most disagreeable kind, whereas other people, including the mayor of Liverpool, who was very clear in his political opinions when he was in this House, was able to work with the government and to put aside party political differences, and I think has showed himself to be a model of how to behave. As regards test and trace in care homes, 120,000 test kits are made available to care homes on a daily basis, so the government is doing everything it can to ensure testing in care homes. And of course, setting up a system from scratch is expensive. That is not something people should be surprised about, but it is a system that is now testing up to 300,000 people a day from zero, obviously, earlier in the year, because nobody knew that they would need to test and trace for this. And I think one should recognise that significant achievements have been made, though of course I accept that they are expensive. I will once again take up the issue of Nazanin Anoushi and Luke Simons with the Foreign Secretary. I do this every week on her behalf. She's right to carry on raising it. The government is doing what it can, but obviously there are limits on what the government can do dealing with foreign regimes that are undemocratic. As regards remote voting, we have discussed this on a number of occasions. It is important that MPs are here. MPs have a right to be here. They are essential workers, and all the advice the government has given, whether it be in Tier 1, 2 or 3, is that people who have essential work to do must carry on doing it. We are in that category. We are expecting people to teach school children. We are expecting other people in other categories to go to work. We should do the same. We have as yet received no formal response from PHE on divisions, but divisions seem to me to be working well and efficiently. We are getting through them in about 15 minutes, which is in line with the time that it takes for a division in ordinary time. And Mr. Speaker, I think it is a system that you came up with, and I think it's one that's working extremely well.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent months, a number of constituents have written to me about completing processes online and it just being assumed that they've got a mobile phone that can receive a code, a smartphone they can download an app on, or indeed just a good enough internet connection that will hold through multiple stages of a process. Given more and more processes are going this way, can we have a debate about how we can ensure some of our constituents are not indirectly excluded from being able to perform everyday tasks?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a really important point, and I'm sure there are many members across the House who understand the challenges facing some constituents in today's digital age, especially in the era of Covid-19, which is replete with essential smartphone apps and fast-moving data. I would like to assure my honourable friend that the government is driving forward access to the digital world. £5 billion spending will ensure that the whole of the UK benefits from world-class broadband infrastructure, and mobile coverage is improving. 91% of the UK is covered by a 4G signal from at least one operator. 91% sounds quite good, but I must confess, when I'm at home in Somerset and I don't have any mobile signal, 91% is not good enough, so it needs to get better. And as we have become more digital, this becomes more pressing.
Let's head to the SNP spokesperson in Scotland, Tommy Shepherd. Tommy Shepherd. Switch yourself on, Tommy. Switch on. The House and worked in a textile mill, you should be able to get this. Unmute. Try again.
Hello.
There we are. Again, Tommy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We should, I suppose, be grateful for small mercies, so I welcome the government's intention to extend both the limited virtual participation and proxy voting until Easter. At least this recognises that normal service will not be resumed anytime soon. It's a slightly more mature and considered approach than the histrionics of last week, where the leader likened MPs to essential service workers. But to be clear, this now establishes a default position, which, whilst better than nothing, hardly represents the optimum or enthusiastic use of technology to deliver democracy. So will the Leader of the House allow a debate at the earliest opportunity after recess on how we can do better, including switching the remote voting system back on and allowing full virtual participation? Now, I know the Leader doesn't support either of these approaches, but he must accept that there is now a majority across the House, including many in his own party, who do. So let's have an open debate on a government motion which can be amended by others, and crucially, since this affects individual MPs in different ways, let us have a free vote on the matter. Mr. Speaker, this week will have brought home to many people in Northern England what it feels like to be Scottish. Devolved structures are created to allow the voice of people in a particular area to be heard, but if that voice differs from Westminster, it is ignored. Moreover, the representatives of the people are then attacked and vilified just to be sure. I feel much empathy with the people in the great regions of England, but my principal concern is that the government's piecemeal approach in England has grave consequences for Scotland. The Barnett formula provides Scotland with a proportion of new public expenditure in England. But what happens when extra spending is only in 10 or 20% of England? The Barnett formula was not designed for such a situation, which is why, Mr. Speaker, I ask again for a debate on helping the Scottish Government to fight the COVID emergency by removing the fiscal and policy constraints which the UK has placed upon it.
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman's initial silence spoke eloquently for why we do not need to have a difference in the technology that we use. It showed through silence why it doesn't actually work, and is why we are keeping this House sitting primarily in a physical sense, certainly for legislation, so that there can be proper scrutiny. It may be that some people like silence from the honourable gentleman. Most of us enjoy his questions, but that is not how to scrutinise Her Majesty's government. As regards the funding for Scotland, UK taxpayers have contributed £7.2 billion to help Scotland, protecting 779,500 jobs. The honourable gentleman heckles me and he says we are UK taxpayers, and doesn't that just prove how beneficial it is to have the United Kingdom? And I'm hoping that he will now become a unionist and join our benches, because it is the United Kingdom that has provided the £7.2 billion and is helping Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland and all the regions of our great nation.
Honourable friend find time for a debate on support given to fairground and showground operators. Their livelihoods have been devastated by restrictions placed on them by the coronavirus pandemic and also the taxation on red diesel.
Mr. Speaker, I'm in so much sympathy with my honourable friend. In normal summers, I spend a lot of time at Fairgrounds. It's one of the things, having 6 children. What else do you do on a Saturday afternoon rather than try and find a fairground? And I miss the opportunity to have done that this year and to do things like opening the Clutton Flower Show, which has lots of amusements attached to it. So he is right to raise this issue. The Chancellor did announce in the budget in 2020 that the government will remove the entitlement to use red diesel from April 2022, except in agriculture, fish farming, rail and for non-commercial heating. This is designed to ensure that the tax system incentivises users of diesel to improve the energy efficiency of their vehicles and machinery, invest in cleaner alternatives or use less fuel. So that is the argument for it, but let us hope that Fairgrounds flourish.
Heading up to Gateshead with Chair of the Backbench Committee, Ian Mearns. Ian Mearns.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Leader of the House for the statement and for earlier this week guaranteeing the time for the very timely and successful debate on Black History Month on Tuesday gone. And Mr. Speaker, we've been able to fill all of the slots available to us in Westminster Hall for the majority of November. On Thursday, the 5th of November, we have 2 backbench debates scheduled, Mr. Speaker. A substantive motion on coronavirus, business interruption loan scheme, and a general debate on the UK's role in ensuring innovation and equitable access within the Covid-19 response. Mr. Speaker, I'm also chair of the all-party parliamentary group for football supporters. And last week we saw England's 6 richest Premier League clubs put forward a disgraceful proposal, Operation Big Picture, to restructure the league laced with bribes to EFL clubs, many of which are in extreme financial duress in order to secure their agreement. Thankfully, these proposals were rejected, but the hairs are running, Mr. Speaker. So can we have a statement from the Secretary of State for DCMS and a debate in government time about the future of our national game, which is at the heart of millions in our country?
The House.
Mr. Speaker, indeed the debate on Tuesday on Black History Month was a very successful debate and brilliantly wound up by my honourable friend. And I'm delighted to hear that Westminster Hall is using its time efficiently. That is very important and is a reason for getting Westminster Hall back up and running, and is another reason actually why we are here physically, to ensure that the government can be held to account, not just in the chamber. As regards Operation Big Picture, I must confess that the detailed workings of the football leagues is beyond my remit and realm of knowledge. Had he asked about the county championship, I would have been better placed to answer. However, I think he should ask his own committee for this debate, because I think it would be very well subscribed and a matter of great interest to many members.
Let's head to East Yorkshire with Sir Greg Knight. Sir Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Leader of the House aware that over the years we've had several debates about unfair practices by the operators of private car parks, culminating in the passing into law of my Private Members Act, the Parking Code of Practice Act, which the Leader of the House supported? Now that the consultation period for the new Code of Practice has closed, can we avoid the need for further debates by the government now acting quickly to bring the new code into force, to bring transparency, fairness and justice for motorists when parking?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend knows the level of sympathy I have for this cause that he has championed so effectively, and he is a fantastic supporter of motorists generally, as the Conservative Party is, but he is a model for how we should back motorists and ensure efficient, fair and well-priced parking, which is one of the essential cogs in our local communities, and much of our local economy depends upon them. Rogue private parking firms, not always private it has to be said, have made drivers' lives a misery with improper fines, harassment and intimidation and overzealous enforcement. I'm very glad that the consultation has started, and I look forward, as he does, to the Parking Code of Conduct being implemented and restoring fairness and accountability, and barring rogue parking firms from accessing DVLA data. And I hope the rogue parking firms are listening, because it's getting that DVLA data that has allowed them to make such a nuisance of themselves.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No other sector has been harder hit by the pandemic than live music, and we've heard research this week that said that the UK's live music sector is facing the loss of 170,000 jobs. That's nearly 2/3 of the workforce. The Culture Recovery Fund helped to some extent, but it didn't help the thousands and thousands of freelancers who make up a big part of the industry. Can we have an urgent statement on what more we can do to help our fantastic, viable, when we're through the pandemic, and world-leading music scene?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I mean, the honourable gentleman does reference the Culture Recovery Fund, which is important. It is a total of £1.57 billion. The Arts Council has spent £160 million of taxpayers' money in an emergency package supporting more than 10,000 organisations and individuals. In addition, there's £3.36 million that's already been allocated to 135 grassroots music venues. So action is being taken, but I completely understand the point the honourable gentleman makes, that it is particularly difficult for freelancers in this area.
We let them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could we have a debate about how many select committees we have in Parliament and the use of cross-departmental committees to scrutinise money spent over a variety of departments?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, select committees is ultimately a matter for the House, and the opportunity to have cross-cutting subcommittees is there for select committees if they wish to set them up amongst themselves. And for the examination of cross-departmental spending, the Public Accounts Committee plays the crucial, most important role, but other select committees can, as I say, collaborate if they wish to.
Mr. Carmichael.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Court of Appeal held that Home Office regulations used for the removal of people under immigration rules were unlawful, rules that have been used in an estimated 40,000 cases. Why has the Home Secretary not come to the House to make a statement in relation to this judgment? Or are the views of the judges of the Court of Appeal now just to be dismissed as a bunch of lefty lawyers?
Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary has the greatest respect for our judicial processes, as do all members of Her Majesty's Government. The Home Secretary will be here for all questions on the 9th of November. But the good news is that there will be legislation on this matter coming forward, which the Home Secretary has announced, which will no doubt increase the clarity over the immigration law.
We now come to Virginia Crosby.
Mr. Speaker, ahead of COP26 and during the lead-up to the UK hosting the presidency of the G7, does the Minister agree with me that we have an opportunity and a responsibility to lead the world? And would the Minister agree to a debate titled "Keeping the Lights On Whilst Reducing Greenhouse Gases"?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend leads the world, or rather Ines Mon leads the world in this respect, with the nuclear power plant that is in her constituency that can keep the lights on and the radiators warm in this country for decades to come, and that is a way of providing green energy. And the UK is committed to delivering an ambitious and inclusive COP26 in 2021, to reaching net zero emissions domestically by 2050, and to doubling our international climate finance commitment to £11.6 billion from 2021 to 2025. But I think the answer, Mr. Speaker, is where Ines Mon leads, the United Kingdom and then the world follows.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Ewan Cameron, was involved in an accident and assaulted. He undertook successful private litigation because basically his insurance company didn't want to know, and then they rebuffed his complaints while withholding information from their own solicitors. Now, the Financial Ombudsman Services found against Ewan, although their complaints handler did make some criticisms of FOSS. The regulator now refuses to engage with myself, saying matters closed. So can I get a government statement advising how the regulators regulated and how I get clarity for Ewan over a saga that spanned a few years now?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, once again, can I pay tribute to the honourable gentleman for the way he highlights issues for his constituents and regularly does so at business questions. Regulators are ultimately accountable, and they are accountable to this House, either via the Treasury Select Committee or via a Treasury Minister. I will happily take this up with him immediately after business questions with, I think it's the Financial Secretary of the Treasury who has responsibility, but I will certainly take it up with whichever of the ministers it is.
Steve Beckham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My council, Kensington and Chelsea, is at the forefront of rolling out electric vehicle car charging. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we need to invest in our electric vehicle infrastructure so that we can phase out diesel and petrol cars more quickly than 2040?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I quite like petrol engines, I must confess, with some old cars, but the government has consulted on bringing forward an end to the sale of new petrol, and Mr. Toad. I think that's a jolly good heckle, don't you, Mr. Speaker? Though I will, for the record, deny that I model myself on Mr. Toad, and I do think that the policy on petrol and diesel cars is going to be beneficial, and a consultation is taking place on bringing it forward earlier. But my honourable friend's absolutely right. The key to making this happen is going to be changes in behaviour, which are going to be driven by the ease of people being able to charge their cars, and that means having more charging points. There is £500 million over the next 5 years to support the rollout of infrastructure for electric vehicles, so taxpayers' money is being spent in this direction.
Let's head up to Greater Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you, and can I thank both the Leader of the House and the Shadow Leader for their kind words over recent weeks for my tandem skydive for local charity. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the brilliant tandem instructor at Black Knights, Lee Rhodes, for safely delivering me back to Earth without the need for a Denton and Reddish by-election. I did the jump for Florence, a 6-year-old girl with a very rare life-limiting genetic disorder called GM1. So can I ask the Leader if he can help find time for either a statement or a debate on GM1 and other extremely rare genetic conditions to help raise awareness across the House?
Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it's very reassuring to see the honourable gentleman, albeit virtually, but nonetheless all in one piece, and to join him in congratulating Black Knights for ensuring that everything happened safely. And how inspirational it is of him, as a local constituency MP, to be raising money for such an important cause. On GM1, I would suggest initially this is very suitable for an adjournment debate, which would of course receive a ministerial response.
John Morrissey.
Mr. Speaker, does the Leader agree with me that at a time of national crisis it is essential that Parliament continues to conduct its business of holding government to account and representing our constituents in this place whenever it is possible? And will he commit to doing all in his power to enable members of Parliament to continue to come to this place in person to enable us to do our duty?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I entirely agree with my honourable friend. It is one of our most ancient rights, going back to 1340, of free, unhindered attendance at Parliament, and there is no law, no local lockdown that may prohibit elected members from attending Parliament. But let us understand what we do in this House. Let us not downgrade our role. We are an essential service. It is crucial that the government is held to account when extraordinary powers are taken, powers that many of us never thought a government would be taking in our lifetimes. These must be scrutinised. They must be voted upon. And my honourable friend is absolutely right to use the word duty. As you personify, Mr. Speaker, you have done your duty every day, and we should do our duty too.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government's view of devolution is that it dictates and local government must obey. The Transport Secretary has written to the Mayor for London, setting out his plans to expand the congestion charge to the North and South Circular, which excludes any opportunity for my constituents to have a say because it wants it imposed in October 2021. So can we have a debate on devolution so that we can speak up for our constituents against this dictatorship from the centre?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman overstates his case, and he needs to remember that the finances of Transport for London were extremely difficult prior to the coronavirus, that the Mayor was not running Transport for London well, he was failing voters in London, and he was running a deficit. Do I want to see widespread extension of congestion charging? Does the Prime Minister know? And the Prime Minister has said he does not wish to see this, because we all know that congestion charging is a means of taxing the motorist, but Transport for London has to be paid for, and the Mayor has singularly failed to do that.
Carter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Last week I received a letter signed by 8 local primary school head teachers concerned about the state of their local leisure centre in Appleton, which hasn't been able to reopen since Covid. That means children can't do PE lessons at a time when we really need to make sure that they're outside and getting lots of exercise. Set against this, Warrington Council have borrowed £1.6 billion to invest in offices in Manchester, supermarkets in Salford, and even an energy company. All this whilst facilities in my constituency are run down and can't be used. Can we have a debate, Mr. Speaker, in government time to look at how local councils have accessed the Public Works Loans Board to fund reckless commercial investments rather than using them to support public facilities like Broomfields Leisure Centre in my constituency?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a really very important point about the use of borrowing by councils, particularly if they're not providing the services that they are meant to provide. And I hope that the good people of Warrington will have been able to enjoy other leisure facilities in the meantime, possibly even private sector ones. But the government is absolutely clear. Councils should not borrow more than they need in advance of their own requirements purely to profit from the investment of the extra sums borrowed. Councils are not speculators and they should not behave as if they are.
We're now heading to Scotland with Patricia Gibson. Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A memo recently leaked to the news agency Bloomberg revealed the view of senior Tories that the majority of people in Scotland support independence. Will the Leader of the House make a statement setting out why he believes that support for Scottish independence is at record levels, and if he agrees with the view in the memo that continuing to dismiss calls for an independence referendum in Scotland is counterproductive?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, 6 years ago, in the year of our Lord 2014, there was a referendum held in Scotland to decide on whether or not Scotland wished to remain a part of the United Kingdom. And the people of Scotland, in their wisdom, voted to remain in the United Kingdom, and that is why they are benefiting from £7.2 billion of UK taxpayers' money to help them through the coronavirus crisis. The benefits of the United Kingdom are enormous, but I would say this as an Englishman, that I think it is absolutely wonderful that we are a single country to which Scotland has contributed enormously over the centuries. We are all kith and kin, and we should be so pleased that we are a single country and grateful for the contribution of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Colburn.
Mr. Speaker, Carshilton and Wallington residents living in New Mill Quarter in Hackbridge woke up again recently to find that they had no heating and no hot water for the 8th or 9th time in just a few short months. This is thanks to the failings of the local Lib Dem district energy network. The scheme has tied residents into a long contract with no option to switch suppliers, and despite these patchy services and high utility prices, cannot essentially do anything about it. So can we have a debate about decentralised energy networks and how we can protect consumers like those living in Hackbridge?
Leader of the House.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend who every single week manages to come up with another example of absolute incompetence by Lib Dem councils, and perhaps he should ask the Backbench Business Committee for a more general debate on why it is the Lib Dems can't run anything, and wouldn't it be better voting Conservative?
Speller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And across the country, the hospitality, sports and leisure industries and their millions of workers are facing closures and restrictions, despite very little evidence being provided that they will have any significant impact on the pandemic, especially the 10 p.m. shutdown. So can we have a specific debate where the government can finally provide the basis for such draconian actions, and we, the industry and the public, can debate them and also be clear whether the benefits really justify the costs of these measures, which frankly seem more driven by being seen to be doing something rather than any evidence.
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, it is always difficult when a debate has already been provided when one is then criticised for not providing quite specific enough a debate. Because in a broad debate, any range of subjects can be raised relating to the coronavirus crisis. And there's a debate later on today and on the Monday when we get back, when these points can be raised. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Health, has made regular statements to this House where he can be questioned on these issues, and therefore I think parliamentary time has been provided, whilst recognising the real difficulty that people in the leisure sector find themselves in hospitality. It is very tough for them, but I know the Chancellor is making a statement later, and I'm sure honourable and right honourable members will want to listen to that with care.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 10 centres such as Accrington and Hassenden are struggling, and we have some of the most amazing businesses such as Unscripted Boutique, DT Laws and Lancashire Tea Rooms. But will the Leader of the House agree to a debate on High Street and Town Centre regeneration so that we can discuss how we can support amazing businesses like mine in Hampden and Hassenden?
Leader of the House. Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to raise the issue of support for town centres, and there is the £3.6 billion Town Centres Fund, which is making really important efforts to help rejuvenate town centres. And town centres are important as community centres as much as for the economic activity they provide, but their economic activity is crucial. I cannot provide a specific time for debate, but I think it is a good issue for a backbench business debate.
Mahali. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that rugby league clubs are the lifeblood of cities like Hull. Yesterday I spoke to the owner of Hull FC, who explained the serious short-term challenges the club faces. Can we have a government statement to scrutinise the evidence behind the decision to close all open-air stadiums, and what support can be given to rugby league clubs if the ban remains until April 2021?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said before in this House, the government is keen to look at ways of allowing spectators to go back in safely and will consider proposals as they are made. I would say my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, will be here to answer oral questions shortly after we're back on the 5th of November, and it would be a good opportunity to raise it with him then.
Mr. Speaker, we all need a little light diversion in these grim times, so could we have a statement in support of the annual World Puddle Jumping Championships, which take place at the much-loved Wicksteed Park in Kettering. This year, due to the pandemic, the championships are going virtual, and children across the land are being encouraged to send in video footage of their jumps, which will be judged on the basis of height of jump, enthusiasm, distance of splash, and the amount of mud covering the participant. Mr. Speaker, isn't this just the sort of tonic we need in these difficult days?
Leader of the House. Mr. Speaker, this is a brilliant idea, and who cannot recall the episode of Peppa Pig, when Peppa decides to go and jump in a muddy puddle, that being her favourite activity. She is joined by her brother George, by her father and her mother, and I've got a feeling even the grandparents join in, and they all get covered in mud. Now, I cannot promise my honourable friend that this will be what the Rees-Mogg household are doing on World Puddle Jumping Day, but I think certainly a number of my children would enjoy doing it very much, and he is to be commended for ensuring that World Puddle Jumping Day has a wider audience.
And we mustn't forget the Vicar of Dibley. Chris Bryant.
I've got follow me, follow down to the hollow ringing through my head now. Can I ask, I'm afraid, about the Standards Committee? As the leader knows, the Standards Committee is meant to have a majority of lay members who are able to vote. We've got a lot of very important business. We've already done 11 reports in this Parliament, and we've got a major review of the Code of Conduct going on. We do need to have a full quota of lay members. I'm really grateful to the Leader of the House for tabling the single motion, which is down on the remaining orders, which would allow for Melanie Carter and Michael Maguire to be added to the committee. Can I please, I know standing orders say we've got to have a 1-hour debate. Can I do a deal with him? If I promise that I won't speak in that debate, and he promises that he will just move it very quickly, we could have a very short debate, and maybe we could get that done very, very quickly so that the Standards Committee can get on with its job.
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, when standing orders provide for a 1-hour debate, it's only right that that time is properly provided should members wish to use it. But the honourable gentleman will be aware that there are concerns over the way the recruitment process was carried out. There is disquiet in certain quarters with regard to that, and that is why the motion has not at this stage been brought forward, though it is under discussion.
We now go to Somerset with Ian Little-Granger.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend will recall the Treaty of Wedmore in Somerset, by which, as he knows, the Vikings were finally kicked out of Wessex. And perhaps there are lessons there for us. Today, we have a counterfeit county council pretending to represent the whole of Somerset, and they want to become yet another faceless unitary authority. They remind me of the Viking army of either the boneless, all brawn and no legs. And thankfully, the government has promised to look at every option, including the excellent ideas, and they are excellent, from Somerset district councils, which captures the true spirit of King Alfred. Their districts want to bring our county together, not divide it still more, and I welcome the fact that the Secretary of State has invited all Somerset councils, including our 2 existing unitaries, to submit ideas. So can we please have a debate on these matters soon? Because this county council are now reminded either the boneless want to destroy our history. King Alfred must prevail, Mr. Speaker.
Burnt scones, come on,
Mr.
please.
Speaker, Ivor the Boneless was given his marching orders actually from Nottingham by Alfred the Great with his brother Ethelred I, not to be confused with the unready one who comes a little bit later. So I think my honourable friend is absolutely right that Ivor the Boneless must be moved out of Wessex, and he ended up going, he ends up disappearing from history, actually, as it happens, and is thought to have died in either 870 or 873. But I have so much sympathy with what my honourable friend is saying, that Somerset is a great single individual county, and it always seemed to me to be rubbing the salt in the wound of the 1974 local government reforms, when Somerset County Council put up signs saying welcome to Somerset when you were just going into their administrative area. You were not entering the great county.
Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we have a debate on the proposition that every child matters? Because I've noticed this morning that the Parliamentary Private Secretary, his honourable friend, the member for Eastbourne, has resigned from the government over yesterday's debate and vote. No doubt because the tone of some of the speeches seem to undermine that proposition and just want to attack the footballer Marcus Rashford, who said today, following what happened, put aside all the noise, the digs, the party politics, let's focus on the reality. A significant number of children are going to bed tonight not only hungry, but feeling like they do not matter because of comments that have been made today. Every child matters. Can't we all agree that proposition?
Yeah. Into the House.
Mr. Speaker, of course we can agree that every child matters. It is a fundamental view of all civilised people. It's not a party political issue. It's not a government opposition matter. The debate yesterday was very clear. It is about how you look after people, not do you look after people. And I would point out that there are 100,000 fewer children in absolute poverty than there were in 2010. There are 780,000 fewer children growing up in a workless household. There's additional £1 billion childcare fund giving parents the support and freedom they need that is being established. So the government is taking great steps to support every child and ensure every child has the best start in life.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I represent many fantastic communities in Redcar and Cleveland, but in Redcar town itself we have a specific problem with car crime. Every day we see images on social media of young lads in the middle of the night shining torches in car windows to look for valuables, and all too often the windows get smashed. I've raised this issue with my local Chief Constable, Cleveland's Acting Police and Crime Commissioner, and the Secretary of State for the Home Office, and now the Leader of the House. So can we have a debate in government time on how we can best tackle this recent surge in car crime? And does he agree with me that the police and the courts should consider using all mechanisms at their disposal to root out the yobs that are terrorising my communities?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this issue and to encourage the police to use all the powers that they have to root out car crime, which is a particularly unpleasant form of crimes, and it must be very difficult for my honourable friend's constituents who are suffering in this way. The government is recruiting 20,000 extra police officers, and several thousand have already been recruited, and that will ensure a bigger police presence for communities across the country, including in Cleveland. My honourable friend will be able to raise these questions further with the Home Secretary, but in this House there are so many ways of raising issues that ups the political pressure: adjournment debates, backbench business debates, urgent questions. And I'm sure with your advice and wise counsel, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend will find all the ways that he will be able to use to keep this issue at the front of public attention.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr Speaker. National Mentoring Day is the 27th of October, and the Mentoring All-Party Parliamentary Group that I chair in conjunction with the Diana Award are absolutely delighted to have over 100 MPs from across this chamber signed up to mentor a young person next week. I had hoped, Mr Speaker, that the Prime Minister may sign up, but hopefully he will tune in this morning and perhaps have a look at this again and lend support. But may we have an important statement or debate on the importance of mentoring, building resilience in young people alongside the long-awaited mental health children's strategy.
Leader.
Mr Speaker, may I congratulate the Honourable Lady for what she is doing in terms of mentoring. It is a way of giving young people a real chance to get ahead in their lives and make their mark. And I'm delighted to hear that 100 MPs are supporting her initiative. I will ensure that a message goes after this meeting to number 10 Downing Street so that the Prime Minister is aware of her request. I can't promise what the answer will be, but I would really thank her for what she's doing. It is so important and such an important initiative.
We go to Harrow Airways with permission to land. Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Ground Control. Mr Speaker, Harrow Council is currently considering 3 very controversial planning applications for building high-density multi-storey flats on Stanmore, Cannons Park and Rayners Lane station car parks. These have received thousands of objections from residents all over Harrow concerned with the loss of car parking and also the imposition of these high-rise developments. Harrow Council Planning Committee is likely to consider the Cannons Park station application in December, the Stanmore station in January, but for some strange reason, Rayners Lane is going to be delayed till June. Stanmore and Cannons Park are both in Conservative-held wards, and the Labour-run council has decided to postpone the Rayners Lane application till after the mayoral elections next year. So could we have a debate in government time on political interference in the planning process, which reeks of corruption?
Leader, I think that's a little bit too long a question.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend raises a point that is deeply concerning and raises a very serious charge. Politically motivated interference in matters such as planning is improper, and I will ensure that the Housing Secretary is made aware of this. It is, of course, a matter for Harrow Council, but once the internal process has been exhausted, it may be possible to involve the local government ombudsman. Local authorities have to abide by a code of conduct, and to make planning decisions for electoral gain is thoroughly improper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My constituent, Mr Latimer, has for nearly 2 decades campaigned to halt the flow of illegal sewage dumping onto Seaburn Beach behind his home. A ruling 8 years ago stated that the levels of sewage breached legal guidelines. New evidence shows to this date dumping levels continue to be breached. This government, the Environment Agency, are ignoring him, the Whitburn Neighbourhood Forum and my pleas to try and sort this out. Why is this, and when can we have an urgent debate on this matter?
Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, this is a matter of great concern. It was raised last week by my honourable friend, the member for Dover and Deal. There are legal requirements on water companies to ensure that sewage is not dumped illegally, and this must be taken up with Ofwat, and enforcement action must be taken if this is happening, and I will ensure that the concerns she has raised are passed on. I can't think of anything more disagreeable for her residents to have to be suffering from this.
Sean Bell.
Mr Speaker, I can take the rough and tumble of this place as much as anyone, but some of the language we saw yesterday was abhorrent, and particularly the use of the word scum. Now, I'm sorry, but when I got a phone call at 11:30 last night from my mum saying that she'd had people using that type of wording down the phone at her because she was my mother, and today my staff members have called me with that type of abhorrent abuse, it is absolutely not on. Can my right honourable friend give us a debate in government time on the standards of conduct that we have in this chamber, because the language we use impact people beyond us, and perhaps you'll bring the honourable lady for Ashton Underline here and apologise, not just to us, but perhaps to my mum as well, who's had to abhor that today.
Leave the House.
Mr Speaker, my honourable friend is right to say this, and can I say that his mother should be so enormously proud of him to be a member of this House. There is no greater service you can give to your fellow Britons than by being a Member of Parliament. It is the highest honour that one can have and the greatest service that one can do. And I'm sure that his mother was aware of that before I said it, but I hope that he will ensure that she does know that this is the high position that he holds and one of honourability. The Chairman of Ways and Means dealt with the issue yesterday in the way you would expect from the Chair and dealt with it extremely clearly, but I would remind people of Erskine May 2121, good temper and moderation are the characteristics of parliamentary language. Inevitably, discussing heated political matters, people state their case forcefully, but they must do so politely.
We now go to Enfield with Ferrell Clark. Ferrell Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has used negotiations with TfL to impose long operational hours for congestion charge and the removal of freedom passes and under-18s passes for transport. Only this week, leaked government plans have shown their intentions to expand the congestion charge to North and South Circulars and impose above-inflation fare rises. So instead of levelling unfounded and unfair criticism at the Mayor of London that has not been levelled at private firms that the government has that during the pandemic, can we have a debate in government time on these leaked eye-watering proposals that are likely to impact over 4 million Londoners, including my constituents in Enfield North?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the Mayor of London has always done everything he possibly can to make life for the motorist miserable and no doubt wishes to continue to do so. He is no advocate of the motorist. The Conservative government, on the other hand, is, with the largest road building programme in decades and a real commitment to making motoring easier and helping people drive in the way that they wish to do. The fact that Transport for London has run out of money is because it was running out of money before the coronavirus hit, because it was badly managed by an incompetent mayor.
Heading to North Devon with Selene Saxby. Selene Saxby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst it is important that our workplace is COVID secure and we lead by example in Parliament, could my right honourable friend advise how we do not overstep into a territory of impractical, unhealthy working conditions which overstretch even government guidance, so that we have an effective, safe yet sensible working environment for colleagues and staff across this House? And what is the process for reversing the unpopular measures that have already been employed as and when we eventually emerge from this pandemic?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend because she gives me the opportunity to pay tribute to the House authorities, obviously to you, Mr. Speaker, and to Marianne Snarski. And between you have done amazing work to ensure that the House's proceedings are carried on in a COVID-secure way and that the staff of the House and of members are kept safe in the House of Commons, whilst we have been following Public Health England's guidelines. My honourable friend is absolutely right to say that we provide an essential service and we must be here, and that the restrictions must be lifted as soon as they can be. They are all temporary. I look forward to this chamber being full and bustling once again, but that will have to come when it is safe to do so. I look forward to not having to wear a face mask, but again, that must be done when it is safe to do so. And we must lead by example to the country at large, both in our dutifulness and in our adherence to the rules.
Alex Davis.
Mr. Speaker, this Sunday our clocks will go back 1 hour as part of daylight savings time. According to a recent government report, though, 59% of the British population would rather remain on summertime, and I think we can all agree that the last thing our country needs is yet another hour of 2020. So with that in mind, will the Leader of the House agree to a debate on government time to discuss the practice of moving clocks backwards so we can follow the EU in scrapping this outdated and unnecessary practice?
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, until the Honourable Lady said follow the EU, I might even have been tempted, but I'm afraid I always enjoy the extra hour in bed. It's such a luxury to find that one gets the clocks going back to Greenwich Mean Time and has that extra hour's sleep. But more importantly, people in Scotland particularly would find very, very late mornings if we didn't change the clocks. And this was debated in 2010 and 2011. It has been considered recently. When it was last tried, it was then unwound, both in the UK and in Portugal. So I'm not sure the appetite for change, and certainly not the appetite to follow the EU, is all that great.
Moving forward to Andrew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In constituencies like mine, the closure of the events and conference industry has hit local B&Bs and guest houses hard. Harrogate and Knaresborough are popular places to visit even when there isn't a pandemic. I know the House will be aware of the Parks and Gardens and Mether Shipton's Cave, and I know my right honourable friend is familiar with Betty's. So with international travel more difficult, please can we have a debate on how best to support our domestic tourism sector and all the excellent hospitality businesses that are part of it?
I am indeed familiar with Betty's, because when I went to speak for my honourable friend, I was provided with a goodie bag at the end of the evening of delicious provisions. And I also note that Harrogate's been declared the best place in the country to work, and I'm sure that's because it has such a fantastic Member of Parliament, and the broadband is merely incidental. But the government is trying to do what it can to help tourism, and with the wider economic package has given one-off grants for eligible hospitality and leisure businesses. VAT has been cut from 20% to 5% until the end of March. Tourism is obviously seasonal, and therefore the situation is being watched closely to ensure that the right policies may continue to be implemented. But my honourable friend may want to raise further questions with the Chancellor, if you've been kind enough to put him on the call list, fairly shortly after this statement.
Gavin Lutz.
Thank you much, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, the honourable member for Murray, called for free school meals to be provided to every primary pupil in the country, stating, "I just want to make sure no one falls through the cracks." Well, Mr. Speaker, last night he failed to vote for free school meals. Indeed, his 5 Scottish colleagues voted against. So can we have a debate in government time about how many children in England will fall through the cracks as a result of his government's refusal to extend free school meals?
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the government has done a great deal to alleviate poverty within children and has provided £380 million in food vouchers in families for need over the summer. Free school meals have only ever been intended to support pupils during term time, but there has been an increase in the universal credit by £1,000 a year, increased local housing allowance, and provide £180 million for discretionary housing payments to councils, plus a £63 million local welfare assistance fund so councils can help those in financial difficulties, and £16 million for food charities. The government takes this issue really seriously and has made great steps to help people who are finding life difficult with the consequences of the coronavirus. I think we must sometimes understand in this House that we seek the same ends but by different means. There is nobody in this House who doesn't want to alleviate food poverty, but there are different ways of doing it. We think it is best done through the normal functioning of the welfare system and by the additional measures that the government has taken. That is an honest disagreement, but it is not a lack of concern.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Friday I visited the Grimsby Seafood Village, which, despite its name, is in my Cleethorpes constituency, and there I met with businesses who have established themselves or indeed expanded during the COVID pandemic. We will need these sort of businesses to develop and establish themselves in order to ensure the economy recovers after we get through the present crisis. Could we have a debate to discuss how we may support new businesses?
Leader of the House. Mr. Speaker, first of all, may I congratulate the Grimsby Seafood Village for doing so successfully under the current circumstances, and my honourable friend for being a promoter of them. The government is taking unprecedented action to support jobs and livelihoods across the UK, with over £200 billion of taxpayers' money being spent, including £11 billion in business grants and £10 billion in business rate relief. The summer economic update contained £33 billion of support, the jobs retention bonus and Eat Out to Help Out, and the Chancellor will be here momentarily, and I'm sure the Cleethorpes champion will be asking for Cleethorpes to get its fair share.
Jim Shum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On August the 13th, 2020, some 60 parliamentarians from 28 countries around the world sent a letter to the Vietnamese President calling for the immediate and unconditional release of imprisoned Vietnamese human rights activist Nguyen Bac Truyen, who was abducted by Vietnamese police on the 30th of July 2017 in Ho Chi Minh City. Truyen's ongoing imprisonment highlights the issues many face in Vietnam in terms of the exercise of their right to freedom of religious or belief. So will the Leader of the House agree to a statement or a debate on this very pressing issue? Thank you.
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is perhaps the House's most tireless campaigner for the freedom of religion and protection for religious minorities against persecution, and he has a great deal of support for what he does. The UK is committed to defending freedom of religion or belief for all and promoting respect between different religious and non-religious communities. Promoting the right to freedom of religion or belief is one of the UK's human rights policy priorities, as it should be. The UK remains deeply concerned about the severity and scale of violations and abuses of freedom of religion in many parts of the world, and this issue will be raised with the Vietnam authorities at all suitable opportunities. But whilst answering the honourable gentleman, may I, Mr. Speaker, congratulate him because I believe he has become a grandfather for the 5th time this week, though he doesn't possibly look old enough to have managed this.
Heading to Peter Bone in Wellingborough. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, a number of members across the House have been campaigning all their political lives to get this country free from the shackles of the European Union. Therefore, it's exceptionally good news that the European Union has recently changed their position on a comprehensive free trade agreement, and Mr. Barnier is coming to London this afternoon to try and finalise that deal. Could the Leader of the House recommend to the Prime Minister that Parliament should be recalled next week for a statement and a debate if such a historic agreement is reached?
Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure my honourable friend took the pleasure that I took that Mr. Barnier decided he might come and talk to us on Trafalgar Day, which seemed to have a certain historic resonance. I don't think it would be right to recall the House next week for a statement, but the Chancellor of the Duchy and indeed the Prime Minister have regularly kept this House up to date with developments in the negotiations.
39 withdrawn to Robert Lagan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can we have a debate on how we can help our high streets and small businesses? I want to highlight the Buxton's Future High Street Fund bid, which has been shortlisted by the government. I sincerely hope is successful. Buxton High Street has had some difficult years, but there are lots of reasons for optimism, such as Buxton Crescent, which has just reopened after a £70 million heritage refurb into a 5-star hotel and spa. Just another one of the brilliant reasons why everyone should come and visit Buxton, Britain's best spa town, as soon as it's safe to do so.
Leader of the House.
Mr. Speaker, Buxton is a wonderful spa town. I might slightly quibble about best, seeing as my constituency is so close to Bath, and I might upset my neighbours if I were to... he corrects me and says it's a city. We can agree. Well, I might get... Harrogate might be upset. I'd better not say which is the best in the country, but it is certainly a very beautiful spa town, and I'm delighted to hear about the reopening of the Buxton Crescent after the £70 million refurbishment. As I said earlier, high streets are essential to our towns and our sense of community, and it is really important to use the Towns Fund, the £3.6 billion Towns Fund, well. But my honourable friend is such a fantastic champion for his own area, and this is important because we want people to visit our great and historic towns and cities and spend money there and keep the economies going and thriving.
Point of order. It relates to something with this business question. Point of order.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. I am seriously worried about the Leader of the House's answer about the Standards Committee because we do need to be fully functioning. It's in the interest of the reputation of the House that we have all 7 lay members appointed. It's 6 months nearly now since we went down to 5 lay members instead of 7. It's 3 months since the Commission, which you yourself chair, agreed the names that came forward through a process in which I was not involved at all. I just wonder whether there's any means of you, because I note that the standing order says that the motion has to, or the legislation says that the motion can be brought forward by any member of the Commission, whether there's any means of you making sure that we are able to function fully as soon as possible.
It's not a point of order for the Chair. What I would say is the Leader has heard what's been said. I don't want to continue the debate from earlier, which as an expert like yourself knows I shouldn't be doing either, but I don't know whether you want to make other comments. Should we leave it at that? We'll leave it at that. Okay. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next. I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. I call the Chancellor Rishi Sunak to make a statement to the House. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me speak first to the people of Liverpool, Lancashire, South Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, and indeed other areas moving into or already living under heightened health restrictions. I understand your frustration. People need to know this is not forever. These are temporary restrictions to help control the spread of the virus. There are difficult days and weeks ahead, but we will get through this together. People are not on their own. We have an economic plan that will protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people wherever they live and whatever their situation. And just as we have throughout this crisis, we will listen and respond to people's concerns as the situation demands. And I make no apology for responding to changing circumstances. And so today, we go further. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was right to outline a balanced approach to tackling coronavirus, taking the difficult decisions to save lives and keep the R rate down while doing everything in our power to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people. The evidence is clear. A regional, tiered approach is the right way to control the spread of the virus. My right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, yesterday set out for the House our economic support for businesses who are legally required to close. We're providing billions of pounds of support for local authorities, a grant scheme for affected businesses worth up to £500 million every month, and of course, we expanded the job support scheme, with the government covering the cost of paying 2/3 of people's normal wages if their employer had been legally required to close. And for areas in Local Alert Level 3, we have made available over £1 billion of generous upfront grants so that local authorities can support businesses, protect jobs, and aid economic recovery in a fair and transparent way. That is our plan to support closed businesses. But it is clear that even businesses who can stay open are facing profound economic uncertainty. This morning I met with business and union representatives, including those from the hospitality industry, to discuss the new restrictions. Their message was clear. The impact of the health restrictions on their businesses is worse than they hoped. They recognise the importance of the tiered restrictions in controlling the spread of the virus. But a significant fall in consumer demand is causing profound economic harm to their industry. It is clear that they and other open but struggling businesses require further support. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm taking 3 further steps today. First, I'm introducing a new grant scheme for businesses impacted by Tier 2 restrictions, even if they aren't legally closed. We will fund local authorities to provide businesses in their area with direct cash grants. It will be up to local authorities to decide how best to distribute these grants, giving them the necessary flexibility to respond to local economic circumstances. But I'm providing enough funding to give every business premises in the hospitality, leisure and accommodation sectors a direct grant worth up to £2,100 for every month Tier 2 restrictions apply. And that's equivalent to 70% of the value of the grants available for closed businesses in Tier 3. And crucially, I am pleased to confirm these grants will be retrospective. Businesses in any area which has been under enhanced restrictions can backdate their grants to August. I have been listening and engaging with colleagues around the House, including but not only my honourable friends Sir Hayward and Middleton, Hyndburn, Penistone and Stockbridge, South Ribble, Burnley, Keighley, Cheadle, Lee and Southport. And I'm pleased to confirm the backdating of the new grants means we are being more generous to businesses and places which have been under higher restrictions for longer. Let no one say, Mr. Speaker, this government is not committed to supporting the people and businesses in every region and nation of the United Kingdom. Second, to protect jobs, we are making the job support scheme more generous for employers. If businesses are legally required to close, as we've already outlined, the government will cover the full cost of employers paying 2/3 of people's salary where they can't work for a week or more. For businesses who can open, it is now clear the impact of restrictions on them, particularly in the hospitality sector, is more significant than they had hoped. So I am making 2 changes to the short-time work scheme to make it easier for those businesses to keep staff on rather than make them redundant. First, under the original scheme, employees had to work for 33% of their normal hours. Now, we will ask them to work only 20% of those hours. Second, the employer contribution for the hours not worked will not be 33% as originally planned, or even 20% as it is in the October furlough scheme. It will reduce to 5%. And the scheme will apply to eligible businesses in all alert levels, so businesses that are not closed but face higher restrictions in places like Liverpool, Lancashire, South Yorkshire and Greater Manchester, as well as the devolved nations, will be able to access greater support. These changes mean more employers can access the scheme and more jobs will be protected. We have made this one of the most generous versions of a short-time work scheme anywhere in the world. It is better for businesses, better for jobs, and better for the economy. Third, as we increase the contribution we're making towards employees' wages, I'm increasing our contribution to the incomes of the self-employed as well. Today, we are doubling the next round of the self-employed income support from 20% to 40% of people's incomes, increasing the maximum grant to £3,750. So far through this crisis, we have now provided over £13 billion of support to self-employed workers. Sole traders, small businesses, and self-employed people are the dynamic entrepreneurial heart of our economy, and this government is on their side. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, a wage subsidy for closed businesses, a wage subsidy for open businesses, cash grants of over £2,000 a month for Tier 2 businesses, and up to £3,000 a month for closed businesses, support for local authorities, support for the self-employed, support for people's jobs and incomes, all on top of over £200 billion of support since March. This is our plan, a plan for jobs, for businesses, for the regions, for the economy, for the country, a plan to support the British people, and I commend this statement to the House.
We now call the Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Annalise Dodds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For months, we've urged the Chancellor to get ahead of the looming unemployment crisis and act to save jobs. Instead, we've had a patchwork of poor ideas rushed out at the last minute. A bonus scheme that will pay £2.6 billion to businesses that don't need it. A job support scheme that simply wasn't going to work for the majority of businesses under pressure, and which we said at the beginning didn't do enough to incentivise employers to keep staff on. And an approach to support for areas entering Tier 3, which has been nothing short of shambolic. This has had real consequences. The deadline for large-scale redundancies came and went before the Chancellor announced the job support scheme. The deadline for small business redundancies passed before he realised he needed to amend it further. And many parts of our country have spent months under Tier 2 restrictions without adequate support. How many jobs have been lost, Mr. Speaker, because of that inaction? Over 1 million have already gone. Last quarter, we saw a record rise in redundancies. The Chancellor could have done much more if he had acted sooner. And now we see yet another last-minute move. Let me ask the Chancellor, what's changed? What's changed that means this is the right thing to do now, but it wasn't when parts of the North and Midlands entered Tier 2 many weeks ago? Does he agree with his own mayor for the West Midlands, who said this particular point was just one that was completely missed? Completely missed the need for support for Tier 2 areas. The Chancellor has only caught up and listened to the anxiety of workers and businesses when it looks like these restrictions will be affecting London and the West Midlands. Will he apologise to those who have already lost their jobs, seen their businesses slip through their fingers in those areas that have not had that support until now? Now, the Chancellor referred to £1 billion of generous upfront grants for businesses and jobs provided in, and I quote, a fair and transparent way. There hasn't been a system of upfront grants for those in the North and Midlands, and the process hasn't been fair and transparent for businesses and workers. To be honest, it's nothing short of insulting to see described what we've seen over the last few weeks as fair and transparent. His government still haven't published the formula that's been used for business support in Tier 3 areas. His government still seems addicted to this approach where they say there are negotiations with different areas, but the reality is something completely different. When will he come clean around that support and the formula that's being used? And will he make good on his government's claim that the JSS extension will be topped up to at least 80% for workers facing hardship? I know this is difficult for the government. I see the Prime Minister sitting next to him. He thought it would be topped up for everyone to, I think, was it 93%, the Prime Minister says? I mean, clearly his government isn't very sure on this, so maybe I can spell it out for them. For huge numbers of workers facing hardship, that support doesn't amount to 80% at all. If they've got modest savings, or if they're excluded for other reasons, as so many are, they've got to wait anyway for 5 weeks before they get that help, and that could be fixed. That could be fixed speedily by this government, but they're refusing to do so. Does he recognise those fixes for social security also must apply for the self-employed, for whom an increase to just 40% of their previous income won't stave off hardship, and that's not to mention those who've been excluded throughout. Mr. Speaker, this is becoming like a long-running television show. The Winter Economy Plan, Series 3. But you know, the twist is, it didn't last the winter, it didn't do enough to help the economy, and it wasn't a plan. We've got to get ahead of this crisis instead of always running to keep up. That's why Labour's called for a national circuit breaker to give the chance to reset, to fix the broken test, trace and isolate system. Time is running out to call for that circuit breaker, so it includes half-term and we maximise the opportunity it brings. Will he change course?
Yeah. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Mr. Speaker, this is the third time I've come to this House in several weeks to outline additional support for the economy, jobs and livelihoods. It is a sign of the seriousness of the economic situation we face, and I will never make any apology for acting fast as the moment demands and as the health situation evolves. But, Mr. Speaker, at the heart of this debate is a more fundamental difference on the right approach for protecting livelihoods and lives. That's right. We, on this side of the House, believe it is right to be honest about the hard choices we confront, that there is no easy, cost-free answer. With every restriction comes difficulty, and that is why we are doing everything we can to strike that balance between saving lives and protecting livelihoods. But we have made progress, and that is why we are now able to operate a localised, tiered approach. That is why even now in the most affected areas, we are striving to keep businesses open. And that is why today the support I've announced is as generous as it is to give as many businesses and employers as possible the opportunity to keep working and keep trading. All of this progress, all of this hope is being put at risk by the party opposite's repeated calls for a damaging, blunt national lockdown. Mr. Speaker, they won't say for how long, but they have already admitted it would roll on with no clear end in sight. They won't say how many jobs would be lost through such a national lockdown, and they claim their approach, an indefinite series of national on-off lockdowns, would be better for the economy. I'm afraid the facts simply don't support that conclusion. Mr. Speaker, the policies we have outlined today do strike that balance. They support our approach, a localised approach, a regional approach, striving to get that balance between protecting jobs and protecting livelihoods. They will support people in every region and nation of this United Kingdom. They will protect people's jobs, they will support their incomes and provide their families with both security and hope for the future. And Mr. Speaker, throughout this crisis, I have always stood ready to work with all honourable members in every business group, industry group and trade union to work through solutions and deal with this crisis. So whilst the situation evolves and the challenges change, my approach will not. To build consensus, to reach out to those with different views, to work past tribal political point scoring and support our country through this moment of immense challenge so that we come out on the other side a stronger, more united kingdom.
We're now going to the chair of the Select Committee, Mel Stride. Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much welcome my right honourable friend's statement, and that once again he has listened to businesses. But when it comes to lockdowns, and I have to say I agree with his remarks that he has just made about circuit breakers, could I draw my right honourable friend's attention to the minutes of the SAGE meeting on the 21st of September, which state, in the context of lockdowns, and I quote, "Policymakers will need to consider analysis of economic impacts and associated harms alongside this epidemiological assessment. This work is underway under the auspices of the Chief Economist." So could my right honourable friend update the House on the progress made by the Chief Economist? And will he agree with me that to ensure a balanced public debate, the Chief Economist or similar economic expert should join the epidemiologists for number 10 COVID press briefings?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for his observation. He's absolutely right. The party opposite did reference the SAGE minutes, but seemed to forget that part of the minutes, which struck very rightly that balance between protecting jobs and protecting lives as well. And he can rest assured that that is what we on this side of the House and in this government will always do. I may spare the Chief Economist the pleasure of the press conferences, but he is right that that analysis is taking place. I've presented some of it at the press conferences. I'm happy to talk more about it at this dispatch box, but fundamentally he will know, as I know, our economy is facing enormous strain. Almost 750,000 people have already lost their jobs, and sadly more will, which is why, Mr. Speaker, a regional targeted approach is the right approach. It allows us to both protect lives and protect livelihoods.
Let's head up to Scotland to the SNP spokesperson, Alison Thewlis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the third statement from the Chancellor in the space of a month, but this is not a good sign of good management. This is a sign of panic and chaos from this government, and none of this should be coming as a surprise to them. It's telling that the government has put out more under embargo today than they gave out to opposition spokespeople, a sign of real disrespect to the other parties in this House. And we in the opposition benches have called for more certainty and a plan, because the evidence is that we are not coming out of this coronavirus crisis any time soon. The Chancellor has not listened and he has not responded. So I ask again for three things. I ask him to listen and to act, to extend furlough and cease at the rates from earlier in the year to protect jobs and livelihoods, to fill the gaps and help those excluded completely from his support schemes. He knows this is a problem and he is choosing to ignore it. To keep the £20 uplift to universal credit and extend this to legacy benefits, including to those who have disabilities. 2/3 of the minimum wage is not enough for people to live on, and not everybody is entitled to universal credit. Huge gaps remain. Carers, asylum seekers, those with disabilities, those with no recourse to public funds have all been left behind by this government, with a cold, long winter ahead. Significant sectors like culture and the arts, hospitality and food and drink wholesalers, tourism, transport and aviation and many more aren't going back to normal anytime soon, and they deserve government support. Will he align his support scheme with the Scottish Government's public health proposals and the other devolved institutions? UK Government support for Scotland does not go far enough to mitigate the local lockdowns we have faced. The UK Government must now provide clarity on the Barnett consequentials to help us plan and to help us protect businesses and our people. The Scottish Government need this now, today, not in 3 months' time, not eventually, and not at some point in the future. We need this now, and the Chancellor should give clarity today on this so the Scottish Government can act. The Chancellor's scheme has been full of holes, time and time again. He comes here in a knee-jerk reaction, full of panic, rather than planning ahead to a situation we told him would arise. This is nowhere near whatever it takes, and I ask him to go further today and work with all the opposition parties and the devolved institutions to get this right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What I'd say to the honourable member is when we outlined the original job support scheme, it was actually very warmly welcomed by not only various business groups, including the CBI, the FSB, the Chambers of Commerce, but also by the trades unions, because everyone at that moment recognised it was a significant and generous intervention to protect the jobs and livelihoods of the British people. But, Mr. Speaker, the situation has changed. The health restrictions are having an impact, particularly in the hospitality sector, which the Honourable Lady mentioned, which is why we have taken the steps we have today, and we are providing the certainty she asked for. For this scheme will last for at least 6 months through to next spring. There is certainty over that. The grants we have outlined today will work on a monthly basis for as long as those businesses are either in their Tier 2 restrictions or they are closed under Tier 3, so businesses can plan on that basis. And lastly, with regard to the Barnett consequentials, this government will always ensure that people will benefit from this support wherever they are living in the United Kingdom, which is why we have provided an upfront guarantee to devolved nations worth £14 billion, which will help devolved nations also plan at what is, I understand, a difficult time for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm really pleased that the Chancellor has listened and shown that this government will always support the North. I'm delighted that these Tier 2 retrospective measures, such as the expansion of the job support scheme and the business grants, will make a massive difference to people living in Glossopdale, in my constituency, who have been under Tier 2. On the point of the business grants, can I urge the Chancellor to make certain that the money and the guidance on how that money can be used is made available to councils as soon as possible, so that those businesses who need it can get it urgently and help save jobs?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and he's been right to champion the situation for his local businesses, and I know this will be warmly welcomed by them, and I can give him that assurance we will work as quickly as possible to provide that guidance, which, as I said, the grant value will be calculated on the number of hospitality, leisure and accommodation business premises, scaled by their rateable value. Added to that will be a 5% discretionary top-up, and then the local authority can use its discretion to allocate that money as it sees fit for their local area.
Mr. Speaker, it seems the Chancellor's much vaunted winter economic plan hasn't even lasted the autumn. His tinkering with the system demonstrates that he's been behind the curve all along, and it's sowed hardship and confusion. So why is the support he offered in March not being replicated as the virus comes back and we're suffering a second wave in October? Why is he trying to achieve local lockdowns on the cheap?
Mr. Speaker, I'd say to the Honourable Lady that I wouldn't consider £200 billion of total support could ever be accused of doing anything on the cheap. That money has gone to support public services like the NHS, people, their jobs, their livelihoods and businesses. And I will commit to this House that we will continue to do everything that is required, and we will continue to adapt and evolve as the circumstances demand.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for bringing forward this package, for listening and acting in the interests of the economy. Isn't it essential that we align the interests of business and the economy with the interests of controlling the virus, rather than let these become polar opposites in argument with each other? And can we perhaps draw back from some of the partisanship that has soured relations over the last few days, because I don't think that does any good for public confidence in how we are all tackling this very difficult and wearing crisis.
Well, I think those are wise words from my honourable friend, and I think he is right to highlight the importance in this House and elsewhere of us adapting a constructive and collegiate approach to tackling what is clearly a national crisis, and one which we will get through, Mr. Speaker, but we will get through it by working together and emerging stronger on the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From tomorrow, Wales will begin a 17-day firebreak lockdown to help control the spread of the virus. And during that period, there will be two support schemes from the Treasury as one ends and another one starts. First Minister of Wales asked the Chancellor to allow Welsh businesses to access the job support scheme a week early, which I understand the Chancellor has refused. So a further request has been made to ease the rules on furlough for 1 week to allow people to get that support. We need to ensure that bureaucracy is reduced, so to allow Welsh businesses to protect jobs. So could I ask the Chancellor, will he be flexible on what support specifically will he give to Welsh businesses?
Mr. Speaker, we've actually tried to reduce the bureaucracy by making sure that we don't have overlapping schemes at the same time. That would only increase complexity for businesses. And we have endeavoured always to provide support on a UK-wide basis. As I've had conversations with the First Minister and others, we are doing this on a UK-wide basis in the knowledge that devolved nations are making individual decisions that ultimately the UK government and UK taxpayer will be funding, and that situation will only work if people can work in a constructive and aligned spirit, which is what I've said to all, and I very much hope that that can be continued over the coming months.
Drew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I greatly welcome my right honourable friend's statement today. The measures which he has announced are significant and generous, and delivered in a manner which is fast becoming this Chancellor's hallmark. May I thank him for hearing the powerful arguments advanced by the West Midlands Mayor, Andy Street, especially in respect of the hospitality industry, and for addressing the serious business jeopardy that did lie between tiers 2 and 3.
Councillor.
I thank my right honourable friend, and he's right. The Mayor, Andy Street, has been vocal, and rightly vocal, in highlighting the particular impact on the hospitality industry due to the impact of the Tier 2 restrictions, and that has helped inform our decision to act today with speed and scale to provide support to those businesses, which I know in his area will be warmly welcomed.
Patrick Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if he regrets ruling out back in the spring out of hand our calls for a universal basic income. I wonder if he'll calculate what impact a minimum income guarantee like that would have had for employers, employees and the self-employed alike, and whether or not, what the overall cost would be compared with the billions he's finding for all these myriad schemes. And will he calculate the long-term costs of millions more on universal credit and other social security benefits, and the consequences that will have for the economy and society?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House don't agree with the universal basic income. It wouldn't be right to provide money to millions of people who have absolutely no need of it. That would just detract our resources from being targeted on those who are in most need. And that is what our approach has done throughout this crisis, Mr. Speaker. But with regard to universal credit and welfare, we on this side of the House believe the best way to help people is to provide them with work and opportunity, which is why all our efforts are targeted on providing that support to protect as many jobs as possible, whilst recognising we will not be able to protect every single job. So we have also strengthened our safety net with billions invested in universal credit and local housing allowance, but also crucially provide funding for new opportunities through training, through apprenticeships, to help people find fresh opportunity and a brighter future.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although I welcome the Chancellor's statement, the imposition of Tier 3 restrictions in Lancashire will inevitably mean that many of my constituents will be significantly worse off. Whilst the additional funding for Lancashire, including the £42 million package, is welcome, there will still be far too many businesses who cannot access the Chancellor's direct support. Hundreds of hotels in my constituency stand to lose thousands in lost bookings, but because they have not been mandated to close, they will not be entitled to the additional support packages. Will my right honourable friend take steps to ensure that businesses such as small hotels, which are completely unviable under Tier 3 restrictions, can access grants and the extended job support scheme?
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to tell my honourable friend that the money that was provided to Lancashire for overall business support as it entered Tier 3 can be used precisely to help the businesses that he rightly mentions that are being impacted by the restrictions, even though they are open. That's what that funding is there for the County Council and other local authorities to do. But I would also say that the enhanced generosity of the job support scheme that I've announced today will go a long way to helping those businesses as well, making it very easy and affordable for them to get the wage support they need from the government to protect as many jobs as possible.
Christine Jardine.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. And while I appreciate yet another partial U-turn from the Chancellor, what this country needs now more than anything else is leadership, clarity, confidence that the government is in control, rather than this constant reaction patchwork with every hallmark of having been written on the back of a cigarette packet that we're getting from this government. I would plead with the Chancellor, please now consider going the whole way and keeping the job retention scheme going after the end of October. Let the devolved nations know what consequences they're going to have, because they need to plan as well. and give the country what the Chancellor promised. The Chancellor told us he would do whatever it takes. Well, this is not it.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady asked for an extension of the job retention scheme. It's worth drawing her attention to the fact that the employer contribution in October of the job retention scheme is 20%. Under the new, more generous job support scheme, that it has been reduced to 5%. It is more generous and it will protect more jobs and more people's livelihoods.
Shall withdraw, Jin Shan?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Chancellor's commitment to helping all of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and we much value the monies that come forward. Can I speak for the distribution sector, who deliver daily perishable foods to care homes, to NHS, to schools, but also to pubs, cafes and restaurants that are closed in Tier 2 and Tier 3 locations? The costs for distribution continue to be the same for jobs and vehicles and for business. So can I make the request and ask the Chancellor, what help can those in the distribution sector access from this announcement? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an important point about the supply chains of those serving the hospitality industry. There are two things I'll draw him to. The Tier 2 grant programme I've announced today will contain a 5% discretionary top-up for local authorities that they can use at their own discretion to support local businesses. They may choose to use some of it for the reasons or the means he outlined. But also, what we have done with the enhanced generosity of the job support scheme is not target it purely at the hospitality industry or indeed purely at businesses operating in Tier 2 areas, because we recognise the complexity of the supply chains that he mentioned, which is why that very generous job support scheme will be available for all businesses in all parts of the country, regardless of the sector they're in. And I think that will make an enormous difference to the businesses he mentions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They say that good things come in small packages. Well, my right honourable friend might be small, but he's delivered a huge package of job-saving, business-boosting support that will benefit the people of Stockton South and right across the country. I'd like to thank the myth, the man, the legend that is the right honourable friend for this life-saving support for businesses in my patch, and ask if he'll continue to review and react promptly to the ever-changing situation in his characteristically charismatic way.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for his, I think, kind compliments, but he will know he is a large part of the reason that I'm in this House, and so he can take much as the credit or blame as is required for that. But I can give him that reassurance. I've been delighted to visit his local businesses with him. I know he is an enormous champion for his local community and for his local high streets and local businesses. He works very hard on their behalf, and I know that the measures we've announced today will make a difference to him and make sure that his community continues to be a thriving place.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Alan Gent runs the Petersgate Tap in my constituency. He employs 5 members of staff. The impact of this pandemic was already choking his business. He's currently not paying business rates, but his private landlord has rejected the request for a rent holiday. And now Stockport is in Tier 3. He cannot stay open. The support currently offered is woefully inadequate. Will the Chancellor now commit to addressing the real hardship of those who work in Stockport's pubs, bars and hospitality sector?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have every sympathy with the honourable gentleman's constituent. I know what a difficult time it must be for him and his team and those that are in similar industries. But what I would say is that actually I think the support provided already will help his constituent. That pub will be eligible for a business rate cash grant of up to £3,000 per month that he remains closed in Tier 2 restrictions. If you look across the UK, obviously it will vary by place. That should largely cover the vast majority of small and medium-sized pubs' rental bills for that time. And of course, those 5 team members that he mentioned could be put on the expanded job support scheme at essentially no cost to the employer, and those employees' wages will be protected and covered by this government.
Drew Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his statement and thank him for all that he is doing. Harrogate and Knaresborough is at the medium tier level, but areas surrounding it are at the Tier 2 higher category. Businesses have noted that with concern, and they're worried about what might happen should the position change in our tier be increased. This enhanced package, I think, will therefore be welcomed, and I welcome it strongly. Does my right honourable friend agree that with the reduction in employer costs, that will result in more jobs being saved?
Mr. Speaker, as ever, I thank my honourable friend for his thoughtful comments, and he's right, and that is why we took the decision to make this a universal approach with enhanced generosity to deal with the situation he mentioned of businesses operating in proximity to other areas under restrictions, those supply chains. This is a universal, generous approach designed, as he said, with a lower employer contribution to make sure that we can protect and support as many jobs as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Back in March, the Chancellor said that with regard to the exhibition sector, those that have physical properties and business rates will be eligible for the cash grant. But when they approached their local councils, they found out that this wasn't true, that because they didn't open their premises to the public, they weren't eligible. Exhibition companies in my constituency have received minimal support and are really struggling. And obviously, conferences and mass events, it looks like they won't be going ahead until the vaccine's in place. Now, it might not offer a photo opportunity like being a waiter at Wagamama, but can I urge the Chancellor to meet with those exhibition companies, including those in my constituency, and hear how much they're suffering?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady might be making disparaging comments about photo opportunities at Wagamama. That's precisely because that sector employs 2 million people. They are disproportionately lower paid from ethnic minorities, younger and women. And it is right that we focus our support on the hospitality sector. They are the ones that are particularly impacted by these restrictions. But she is also right to highlight the plight of those in the events and exhibitions industry. I'm very sympathetic to that. Those businesses with business premises will receive business rates relief if they are in those categories. And indeed, the Tier 2 grants that we announced today in the categories I said would include hospitality, leisure and accommodation. Under the VOA office codes, exhibition and event spaces are typically included in that, so they would be included in the calculation of the grant value provided to local authorities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Business leaders I speak to, both in Arundel and South Downs but nationally, recognise that tailoring your response to the circumstances is a strength, not a weakness. They also know there's no easy choices, but the worst of all worlds would be a blunt national circuit break which would cost rather than save jobs.
My honourable friend is absolutely right on his last point, and I know with his considerable business experience that he brings to this place, we're lucky to benefit from that, and he's right. In business and as in public policy, it is right that you evolve and adapt to the circumstances. That is what we have done today, but it is right that we do it in a targeted, tiered way, not the blunt national instrument that, as he rightly says, would unnecessarily cause hardship and cost jobs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand that 4:30 today, Government Minister will meet with local leaders in Nottingham to put us into the third tier. We have to find this out through the media because local members of Parliament haven't been invited, which is saddening. But we, of course, if there are measures that need to take place to protect the health and well-being of our community, of course we will support them. But these will have a profound impact on our local economy. So I asked the Chancellor today, if Nottingham moves into Tier 3 this afternoon, what package of support will he be putting in place to protect our jobs and businesses?
Mr. Speaker, I know it will be a difficult time for the honourable gentleman's constituents, and he's right that they should engage constructively, and I'm glad that he and his local area is doing that. There will be a variety of support available. For closed businesses, they will receive grants of up to £3,000 a month paid centrally. Obviously, there will be a negotiation and a conversation with the Community Secretary, which will result in an amount of support being provided for businesses similar to other areas. And of course, there is a formula to provide support, as he will know, up to £8 per head for the local authority. And that money is used to enhance local compliance, enforcement and contact tracing. So I know those conversations are ongoing, and I very much hope they can have a constructive outcome.
Let's head to Essex with Stephen Metcalfe. Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome my right honourable friend's statements and thank him for supporting people and businesses across Essex. Already over 15,000 people have benefited from the furlough scheme and over 5,000 from the self-employed income support scheme. These additional measures to support those who have been adversely affected by the recent introduction of Tier 2 in Essex are a real welcome addition. And will he confirm that he will continue to do whatever it takes to support our country and our economy?
Mr. Speaker, I can give my honourable friend that assurance, and he mentioned some numbers, and that's ultimately what it is about. We stand in this place and talk about many billions of pounds and policies, but ultimately it's about the people, their jobs and their livelihoods that we are trying to protect. And I'm delighted to hear that the 20,000 people that he mentioned will have benefited from the support that this government has put in place, and I can give him and them the assurance that we will continue to do exactly that.
Wales enters a firebreak lockdown tomorrow evening. There are concerns that there will be a week-long gap in support between the end of the furlough scheme and the introduction of the new wage support scheme. It would be good if the Chancellor could consider giving Welsh businesses early access to that scheme, but can I ask him to clarify its eligibility criteria, and in particular whether seasonal workers will be eligible for support?
Mr. Speaker, there won't be any gap in support, and please tell the honourable gentleman that, because, as you know, the CJRS runs all the way to the end of this month, and the job support scheme starts on the 1st of November. So there'll be complete coverage and no interruption in that. We've provided Barnet funding on the grants from the moment I announce them, so that is also available to the Welsh Government. And with regard to the specific treatment of seasonal workers and the computation of the reference earnings, that is set out in the guidance for the CJRS, and that will remain consistent in the new job support scheme.
Fuller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 8th of July, my right honourable friend said his measures would be, quote, always unencumbered by dogma and driven always by the simple desire to do what is right. He was right then and he is right today in announcing these measures. And I noted the extension in support for the self-employed, which will now extend all the way through to April. Can my right honourable friend assure me that he is also working with the Secretary of State for Health to ensure that we're doing whatever we can to get self-employed people and everyone else into work and back to work without restriction as quick as possible?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Those who are self-employed are part of the entrepreneurial side of our economy. They will help drive our recovery. It's right that they receive support, and I'm proud that the support we've put in place, over £13 billion, benefiting almost 3 million people, is one of the most comprehensive and generous packages of support for the self-employed. But ultimately, his last point is the one we should focus on. The best way to help people is allow them to get on, do the job that they love doing, and allow them to trade.
Chris Brown. I'm not going to quibble. I think all of this is good, and I'm delighted that it's being announced today. I do however, just want to say to the Chancellor that some of the things that he's announced apply across the whole of the UK. Some of them apply only in England. And this does provide a lot of confusion for a lot of ordinary people out in the country who don't watch what we're doing in here every day and don't follow every element of the minutiae. Can he just clarify precisely how much money is he really announcing that is new money today that is going to be spent in England through the local authorities on these new business grants in Tier 2 areas? And how much extra money, I don't want to know about the 14 billion, which was from earlier, for the devolved nations. I want to know how much extra money, because of Barnet consequentials, is now coming to Wales.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his comment, and he is right. I can appreciate the confusion, and as we do try and do things on a UK-wide level, obviously not everything will be. I can't give him a precise figure because these are demand-led schemes. What we have tried to do is provide upfront funding guarantees in advance of that demand being drawn down in England and the Barnet consequentials being delivered. We true those up on a regular basis. I'll be happy to write to him with further details, but on a regular basis we true up the amounts but try and provide the funding to Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland in advance of that demand actually occurring in England, which I think is a better and more generous approach for devolved nations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Chancellor's statement. Keeping a link to viable jobs is absolutely crucial. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is better to keep businesses open and functioning where possible with support than locking down nationally multiple times?
Yeah, my honourable friend is absolutely right. When I talk to both businesses and employees, what they want is to be able to go to the jobs they love. They want to be able to do that. They want to be able to serve customers, and they want to be able to welcome us all back to their restaurants, pubs and cafes and likewise. So she's right, we've got to strike that balance. I think the approach this side of the House has taken is the one that does that. It strikes that balance, and the support we've put in place today will enable as many of those people to remain in their job, working hard, and hopefully have a fulfilling future to come.
We're going up to Scotland with Deirdre Brock. Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see that the Chancellor has found the magic money tree of Tory myth and has given it another shake. But the money needs to go to the self-employed, the smallest businesses, the poorest households. He'll have total control of VAT soon. Will he look at cutting the tax on household essentials? And will he target the support for job retention schemes at the smallest businesses so that they can continue to employ people rather than offsetting the wage bill of some supermarkets? Tesco, Sainsbury's and Waitrose aren't feeling the pinch from this the way that small enterprises are. Will he send the cash where it will do the most good?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right in saying that support should now be targeted on where it can make the most difference. And that's why our approach has evolved through this crisis. What was universal in the beginning, at the peak of the crisis, has now evolved into a more targeted approach. To give her one example, a difference between the job support scheme and the old furlough scheme is that now for large businesses, precisely the kinds of businesses she mentioned, they will not be able to access the job support scheme, especially with its new more generous terms, unless their business is seeing revenue declines. That is a sensible change, which means that support is rightly targeted on those smaller and medium-sized businesses who need our help at this difficult time, and not the large businesses who are not seeing any change to their business model.
Let's head to Ludlow with Philip Dunn. Philip Dunn. No. Yes? Naz Shah.
Speaker. I don't need to tell the Chancellor that where we're going, where the economy is plunging further into a crisis. The biggest thing that businesses tell me in my constituency is uncertainty is their biggest enemy. We've been in extra restrictions for over 150 days now. If we go into Tier 3, and given that he doesn't want a planned circuit breaker, what support will he give the businesses in my constituency of Bradford West? And importantly, how long should they be prepared for uncertainty?
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to tell the Honourable Lady that the Tier 2 grants that I announced today will be backdated. So for her businesses and her local authority will receive funding backdated to when they entered Tier 2 restrictions. And I think those grants worth up to £2,000 or just over a month will be of an enormous support to her businesses and what I appreciate is a difficult time.
James Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although Norfolk remains in Tier 1, this additional support for hospitality, tourism and other businesses is very welcome. And as well as the short-term measures in this plan for jobs, looking longer term, will my honourable friend bring forward proposals at the spending review for tourism zones, including one for Norfolk and Suffolk, and also accelerate the rollout of gigabit broadband for businesses in North West Norfolk so they benefit from greater connectivity sooner?
Well, my honourable friend is regularly reminding us all about the importance of digital connectivity in rural areas like his and indeed mine. And he will know, as I do, that this government is committed to bringing both gigabit-capable broadband and indeed mobile phone network to all those parts of our country that otherwise might not have as strong connectivity as they would like. And I know he will join me in welcoming that, but it also will make an enormous difference to the local economy in his and other rural areas.
Let's head up to Greater Manchester with Debbie Abrahams. Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 23 OECD countries had job subsidy schemes in place for a major event such as a pandemic. Unfortunately, the UK wasn't one of them. This government's piecemeal approach to the pandemic is leading many of my constituents to ask why we were so poorly prepared in every single way for this pandemic. In Oldham East and Saddleworth, unemployment has nearly doubled since March. We know now across the country that nearly 300,000 people weren't eligible for social security support, a third of whom were disabled, and 1 in 10 were from the North West. So for those low-income workers covered by this new financial package, how many will be excluded from social security support to top up their wages?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right to say we did not have a wage support scheme when we entered this crisis, which is why I'll place on record my thanks to the fantastic team of officials, both at the Treasury and also HMRC, for acting with unbelievable speed and decisiveness in helping me create, design and implement these schemes in record time, enabling us to help pay the wages and protect the jobs of over 9 million people.
Dr. Luca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night I had a meeting with Hinckley Bid and met with businesses who raised their concern about what would happen if they go into Tier 2. I told them at the time the Chancellor and the Treasury were listening. I'm pleased to welcome the support coming in for Tier 2 today, should indeed my area move into that area. In the spirit of listening, would he consider providing a roadmap for areas that are struggling the most, like weddings, events and conference and travel industry, to try and give them some clarity and certainty going forward?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this, and I know he has raised the impact of the potential Tier 2 in his area on his businesses with me, and hopefully he will be reassured by the announcements today. Now, with regard to travel and events, and those things are interlinked, I think, as he knows, as I know, we must work on finding a way to allow more travel to happen. That is something that the Transport Secretary has spoken to colleagues about and is actively engaged in working with industry and health professionals to see what more we can do to facilitate greater ease of travel and therefore open up just travel corridors, but also help our events industry as well.
To North Down with Stephen Farry. Stephen Farry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is important that the public health and economic support measures move in harmony. Northern Ireland had to go into tighter restrictions on the 16th of October ahead of other parts of the UK. The 20% employer contribution on the outgoing job retention scheme is a major challenge for employers to keep jobs. Given that the Chancellor has shown some flexibility today, can I ask him to reconsider the timescale on the new scheme and potentially backdate the 5% employer contribution to the 16th of October?
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that the grants are backdated, if that results in extra Barnett consequentials, of course that extra funding will flow to Northern Ireland as it will to other devolved nations. With regard to the job support schemes, as I said before, there will be no interruption of coverage between one scheme to the other. And as he points out, starting on November the 1st, the employer contribution will be significantly reduced.
Jenny Davis.
Speaker, I am incredibly grateful to my right honourable friend and indeed the whole Treasury team for the work they've put in, and special thanks to my honourable friend the member for East Surrey for her engagement on this matter as well. I'm already receiving messages from my constituents absolutely delighted with these schemes. That's Bishop Auckland landlords who are going to be helped out by this. So I just have one question, and that is how quickly can we expect these grants to hit businesses? I know County Durham did an exceptional job at getting those out last time, but if we could provide a timeline, that'd be very helpful. Grateful.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know my honourable friend is a proud champion of all her local pubs, especially judging from all her Instagram photos. I'm very jealous, but having visited at least many of them with her on the campaign, I'm glad that she is providing them with the support that they need at what is a difficult time. I know the grants today will make a difference. I can reassure her we will work very quickly in getting the guidance out. The funding will be available on a monthly basis, starting as soon as we start the restrictions, and a month later the funding will be there for those businesses to pay out.
Heading up to Scotland with Martin Day. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard the latest package of COVID measures to be announced, and we clearly face a further protracted period of the crisis ahead, with more and more areas going into local restrictions. And given the regional packages announced for England regarding the Barnettisation, will the Chancellor tell us exactly what these consequentials will be, as devolved nations need to plan properly for their own mitigation measures?
Mr. Speaker, I refer the Honourable Gentleman to my previous answer. We've taken the approach of providing upfront funding guarantees to devolved nations. That's worth £14 billion currently, and on a periodic and regular basis, we will update and review those. But in all ways, when dealing with these demand-led schemes, it's difficult, which is why we've taken the approach, which I think is generous and better, of providing upfront funding to devolved nations.
Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor's measures will be very welcomed by the hospitality sector in London. So I hope he might have a word with the Health Secretary about the point of a 10 p.m. curfew if it's members of a family dining together. But beyond that, will he also look carefully again at support for the events sector? That's the sector, as he knows, which supports not just private events but many large corporate events too. We have a great number of those of the highest quality in London. There are thousands of jobs involved here, millions of pounds of turnover, but for example, because they do not serve food direct to the public, they've not so far been able to benefit from the business relief scheme because they're not open to the public for their production kitchens. Can we look at those loopholes that they've been falling through?
I thank my honourable friend for his comments. I think he raises a couple of points. I think one, where the guidance is not clear, where businesses are legally required not to open but not legally close and therefore don't benefit some particular support, that's something that we are actively looking at and making sure we can fix. I think more broadly, the Tier 2 grants I've announced today, events and exhibitions are one of the VOA categories that will be included in the hospitality leisure calculation that we use. But more generally, I think the best thing we can do is try and open up more travel, and indeed, as over time progresses and we can use more testing, is try and get life back into that sector by allowing them to get on with what they want to do, do, was just put on fantastic events.
Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So in March, the government did increase the basic allowances for both universal and working tax credit by £20 a week. But this uplift is only temporary and will expire next April. So does the Chancellor accept that after what we all expect to be a tough winter ahead, this will mean taking nearly £1,000 a year away from those families who really need it?
Mr. Speaker, we did put in place the temporary uplift into universal credit, but as the Honourable Gentleman says, it still has 5 or 6 months to run and will be in place to support vulnerable families throughout the difficult winter period and is there all the way until next spring.
Can I welcome these measures announced today? As the Chancellor will be aware, 15,400 people have benefited from the furlough scheme in South West Hertfordshire, and I applaud the sustainable and affordable approach he has adopted. Does he agree with me that the approach needs to remain pragmatic and an evolution of policy to give more certainty to our communities?
Yeah, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right. And in the face of something that we've never seen before, that we're all grappling with how to deal with, it is right that we remain pragmatic and flexible. It is not right to be wedded to dogma and be unwilling to change when the facts change. That's what we will always do, both as we grapple with the health crisis and the economic crisis, remain flexible and nimble, but always with the same values and principles underlying what we do, which is try and protect as many people's jobs and livelihoods as we can.
Heading up to Scotland with Kirstin Oswald. Kirstin Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK government waxes lyrical about a flexible labour market as a strength of the UK economy, but the Chancellor's support packages have excluded millions and so many will continue to be excluded from support. So will the Chancellor please look again at provisions for the millions who still fall through the holes in his schemes? And if he won't do the right thing by these excluded groups, will he please release the resources to devolved administrations to allow them to do so?
Well, Mr. Speaker, our support for the self-employed remains one of the most comprehensive and generous anywhere in the world and is now approximating £13 billion for almost 3 million people. But Barnett consequentials of over 13 or 14 billion pounds have been provided to devolved nations, and if the Scottish Government chooses to do something different with that, that is of course up to them.
Jake, withdrawn. Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the last 6 months, the number of people forced to claim unemployment benefit in Barnsley has doubled. If the Chancellor is saying livelihoods have to be balanced against lives, should the people of Barnsley expect unemployment to rise, the death rate to rise, or both?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's exactly because we need to adopt a balanced approach, which is why we've taken the more regional and tiered approach that we have done. And we've never pretended that there are easy choices here. It would be wrong to say otherwise. We are balancing protecting the economy, protecting people's jobs and livelihoods, whilst also suppressing the virus and doing so in the least damaging way possible. There is no perfect answer, and as I said, there are no easy choices, but we will always be honest about that and try and tread that careful path between those two things. What I think would be more damaging for people's jobs and livelihoods is a blunt national lockdown, which would inflict unnecessary hardship and suffering on people where the virus is not particularly rampant.
Mr. Speaker, throughout this crisis, the Chancellor has shown himself to be adaptable, nimble, flexible, dexterous, agile. Maybe it's the Peloton bike or a yoga exercise, I don't know what it is, but they are skills, critical skills, essential in success in any endeavour. I thank the Chancellor from the bottom of my heart for the measures that he has announced today. They will benefit my constituents who have struggled so much to keep their livelihoods afloat, and I am truly grateful to him. Does he agree with me that the sledgehammer blunt instrument of a circuit breaker, fire breaker, call it what you like, that type of lockdown will be devastating to our communities, devastating for our economy, and will he do everything he can to ensure that that does not happen?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I thank her for her warm words. And she knows, as someone who is a huge champion of small business in her area, repeatedly bringing their concerns to this chamber, how damaging it would be to inflict unnecessary pain and suffering on those businesses and those people's jobs and livelihoods. That's why the Prime Minister's approach, this government's approach of a regional tiered strategy, is absolutely the right one.
Let's head up to Greater Manchester with Tony Lloyd. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor will recognise that whilst the tier system is only a few weeks old, Greater Manchester has been de facto in Tier 2 for 3 months now before moving into Tier 3 this week. The Chancellor told the House, my honourable friend for Bradford, that these grants will now be retrospective. Can he be absolutely clear? Will the grants for Greater Manchester go back to the beginning of our period of de facto Tier 2 and not simply when the government introduced the more formal legalistic Tier 2?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can and I hope I did provide that reassurance for all areas that have been suffering essentially de facto, as you said, restrictions. We will backdate the grants through to the beginning of August as required, and that will benefit many local businesses in Greater Manchester. And I'm grateful to the representations I had on this fact from many colleagues around the House, including many of the ones I mentioned earlier in my statement.
Let's head up to Yorkshire with Julian Sturdy. Question of the day will now go up to Scotland with Neil Gray. Up to Scotland, Neil Gray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's taken weeks for him to tinker with his job support scheme to get it to a better place, as if he was surprised about the impact of the necessary public health restrictions would have. But it really begs the question why he didn't just keep furlough. But the big question today is why did he not do anything about making the universal credit £20 per week lifeline permanent and extending it to legacy benefits, which would have disproportionately benefited disabled people at this difficult time?
Mr. Speaker, maybe the honourable gentleman knew something that the TUC and every other business group didn't know when they warmly welcomed the introduction of the job support scheme. But I'm grateful to have his thoughts. I mean, he might also want to have a word with his colleague who asked a question previously, saying it was wrong to give support to large businesses that were benefiting from this crisis. That's exactly why it would be wrong to extend the furlough scheme. The job support scheme is more targeted in its approach, make sure that those types of businesses are not able to access support, and indeed, as I've mentioned, is more generous to employers than the October furlough scheme.
You, Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I warmly welcome the Chancellor's statement and indeed thank him and his colleagues and indeed the Department for everything they are doing. It would take the most churlish of people to claim that this is anything but flexible, nimble and massive support for business. In making the job support scheme more generous, I recognise the Chancellor is now providing support for businesses that are open, and that's absolutely welcome. What steps are being taken to make sure that those businesses that are open and perhaps don't need as much support, or indeed there could be fraudulent claims, are in place to protect the taxpayer?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and that's why we've evolved our approach. Whereas earlier on in this crisis, when we were facing something that was happening at enormous speed and severity, we erred on the side of being more universal in our approach and acting quickly. Obviously, as time has progressed, we can be more targeted, more effective to root out misuse of these schemes and make sure support is targeted where it is most needed. As I said, one of the examples of that are all the various new eligibility criteria for the job support scheme, ensuring that large businesses that are suffering or not suffering a revenue decline will not be able to access the scheme. There's also conditions around the redundancy notices and also the ability of large companies to make capital distributions whilst using the scheme. All of these are sensible changes that go at the heart of what he said. We should target our support on those who really need it.
Let's return to Yorkshire. I think he's got his voice back with Julian Sturdy. Julian Sturdy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Take two. Can I thank my right honourable friend for listening to the concerns that have been raised by York's tourism and hospitality sector and announcing an extensive package of support for areas like York that have been left in limbo under the Tier 2 restrictions. But does he agree that the best way to support York's wider economy is to get us back to Tier 1 as swiftly as possible? And can he assure me that the support announced today will not be used to justify prolonged additional restrictions for longer than is actually necessary?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The best way to help businesses and protect people's jobs is to allow businesses to trade and allow the economy to function as normally as possible. The support we've put in place today will not be used as an excuse not to do that. And as the Prime Minister said, we will be reviewing all of these restrictions on a 28-day basis. And of course, we all want to try and see our local areas get back to as much of normality as they can as quickly as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 109 coach companies have gone bust, with 7,100 people made redundant, which is 1/6 of the entire coach industry. And one reason they tell me is because they fall between gaps in support, being classified as neither tourism nor essential travel. Please will the Chancellor look urgently into what specific support can be given the coach industry, and if the relevant minister will meet with me and representatives of the sector to discuss their concerns.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to organise for a relevant minister to meet with the Honourable Lady, and hopefully those companies, and she's right about the difficult time that they are experiencing, will have been able to access, for example, the bounce-back loans or the CBIL loans to help them with cash flow, ditto with the VAT deferral and time to pay. But I appreciate it is a difficult time for them, and the best thing we can do is allow more economic activity so they can get their coaches full as quickly as possible.
Can I warmly welcome this package of support? I think, nevertheless, as the Chancellor has acknowledged, this will be a difficult winter for some businesses. When we move into, hopefully, a spring recovery, we'll see the reintroduction of the full rates of VAT and business rates. Would my right honourable friend consider phasing in the reintroduction of those at slightly lower levels to allow businesses to get back on their feet in these very important sectors?
Mr. Speaker, as ever, I'm grateful for my honourable friend's advice and support. And he's right, the business rates holiday we've put in place this year has provided over £10 billion of support to almost 1 million businesses. I know what a vital lifeline it is. So, of course, we keep all measures under review, and future fiscal policy is for budgets. But I thank him for raising the point with me.
Let's head back to Yorkshire with Richard Bergen. Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I previously asked the Chancellor about furloughed workers having to survive on less than the minimum wage, his callous response was that they would be, and I quote the Chancellor, able to work elsewhere. Yet minimum wage workers in very high virus areas, whose workplaces have been forced to shut, will now have to live off just 2/3 of the minimum wage. That's just £5.81 per hour, the minimum wage level of 11 years ago. So will the Chancellor introduce a wage floor so no such worker has to live off less than the minimum wage?
Mr. Speaker, we've addressed this point before, but I'm happy to repeat it. For those who are very low-paid workers, they will benefit from the flexibility and responsiveness of universal credit. And that is which universal credit taper works. The way it works is it will replace the falls in income with a top-up in universal credit worth about 63 pence in a pound, meaning, for example, a single person in their late 20s working in hospitality, renting privately in a flat, for example, in a northern city, will receive about 92% of their original income on an after-tax and after-benefits basis.
Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also warmly welcome the Chancellor's statement today? Does he agree with me that it is vital and absolutely right that we take this decisive action to support businesses and jobs today? But it's also important that we are mindful of the sustainability of public finances for tomorrow.
Chancellor.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and he would have seen the figures from this week detailing the difficult situation of our public finances, the scale of the borrowing, the scale of the increase in our debt this year. And whilst right now our primary focus should be on supporting jobs and employment, given the restrictions in place, it is always right that we have one eye on the future. We must be careful not to mortgage our children's futures, and that's why our interventions will be done in a way that is sustainable and affordable for the long term to ensure that we live within our means over time.
Heading to Greater Manchester with Andrew Gwynn. Andrew Gwynn.
Thank you. I was critical of the Chancellor on Tuesday, so I want to thank him for listening and acting
reflecting on one of the key asks of all Greater Manchester MPs, of all the council leaders in our city region, and yes, of our Mayor Andy Burnham too. And that's that our businesses and supply chain should be supported in Tier 2, because we've had 12 weeks of these measures with no help and no support, and many really are struggling as we tip into a stricter Tier 3. For some it will be too late, but I thank him for making this retrospective. How soon will these funds be released? Because it is pressing. And what calculation has he made of the 12-week entitlement for Greater Manchester businesses?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his comments, and I tell him we'll work very quickly with the VOA to calculate the value of those grants. We're just working through that detail, and I hope to be able to provide him with the figures and all Manchester MPs as soon as possible, and we will of course release that funding as quickly as we have calculated the values.
Speaker, and on behalf of my constituents, can I thank the Chancellor for this comprehensive economic package. Clearly, he's a Chancellor who listens, and I thank him for that. Will he join me in commending Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands, who campaigns passionately for further support, who's not a showboater, who just gets on with the job and gets things done?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. I'm always grateful to hear from the Mayor, Andy Street, and my honourable friend is right. Andy has rightly put on the agenda the situation of especially hospitality businesses in Tier 2 areas that he represents, and wanted me to be aware of what was happening. And I'm glad that today's set of measures will make a difference to both my honourable friend and Andy's wider set of businesses, and I know to many other businesses across the country.
Let's head up to Merseyside with Bill Esterson. Bill Esterson.
The Chancellor says he will only support viable businesses. Kim runs a wedding photography business. She's self-employed and she works from home. And like millions of people, she hasn't qualified for any of the measures the Chancellor has announced. Weddings will need photographers again, and Kim already has 71 bookings for next year. So what is the Chancellor's message to Kim and millions like her about why he thinks her business isn't viable?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy if the honourable member wants to write to me with the particular circumstances of Kim, and I'd be happy to see what various things we have done that may be of benefit to her and her business.
Tom Hunt.
I welcome this statement. It will ensure that the hospitality sector, even in those areas with much greater restrictions than my own, can hopefully keep going and come through this, as opposed to the approach of the Labour Party would hammer the hospitality sector, even in areas such as mine in Ipswich, where we currently have very low levels of COVID. And it would also give some reassurance to my constituents that if worse does come to a worse and cases increase, that there's that additional support there. One of the things that I thought some of these grants could be used on is potentially winter heaters and gazebos, because we can still socialise outside in the winter months. Wanted to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that's a very, very interesting idea. Obviously, for areas in Tier 3, the local authorities receiving funding to use at their discretion, it may well be that that is an idea they want to take up. And of course, for both open and closed businesses in Tier 2 or 3, I've announced a series of grants today, and that will be obviously up to the business to use for whatever it wants. Primarily, we assume they will use them to cover the fixed costs of things like rent, but of course it will be up to them what they use them for. But he makes a good suggestion, together with our planning changes, meaning that those businesses can serve as many customers as possible, even though they face restrictions at the moment.
53 withdrawn, so Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I warmly welcome the additional support for Tier 2 areas, like my constituency in London. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that we need to get London back into Tier 1 as soon as possible, since London is the engine of this country's economy, accounting for 25% of all tax revenue?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is a proud and rightly proud champion of her businesses in central London, and obviously what is happening not just to our capital city but to all our city centres is incredibly sad. I think we all want to see them springing back to life and vibrancy, but hopefully the measures we've announced today will provide some support and breathing space to help them get through a difficult period until they can get back on their feet and do exactly what we want them to do, which is return to where they were, bustling and welcoming us all back into their shops and restaurants.
Well, let's head to Walthamstow with Stella Creasy. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor says that he's been talking to the people who are worried about their livelihoods and the businesses facing redundancy. So he will know that those redundancies are particularly heavily falling on mums. We know from the ONS data produced last month that 79% of the increase in redundancies has come from women, and we know it is mums who are losing their jobs. But his department is sitting on £1.7 billion worth of unspent child-free tax care funding. So will he use that money to make sure our childcare sector can support every parent who wants to get back to work and stop the tsunami of mum unemployment we're about to face?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is right to highlight the particular importance of good quality childcare, and I think, as she said, enabling mums to be able to protect their employment. I'm happy to look at the specific suggestions she mentioned, but I think we have made recently, in the last budget and before, some changes to the operation of tax-free childcare in order to access, so it's more available to more people. She's right that the take-up hasn't been what it's forecast, which is why we put the changes in place to broaden the approach and broaden the eligibility of people on it, but I'm happy to look at her specific suggestion.
To Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my right honourable friend for the provisions announced today, which I very much welcome. My constituency is partly in Tier 1 and partly in Tier 2, and I particularly welcome support, especially for Tier 2 areas, but also across the board in Tier 1. Many constituents have contacted me who work in the wedding and events sector or across its supply chains with difficulties due to restrictions, uncertainty and drop in trade. Can my right honourable friend confirm that today's announcement will also support the events sector and, crucially, those working across its supply chain?
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely because we took a generous and universal approach with eligibility for the job support scheme with its new generosity that supply chains of all affected industries will be able to benefit. And there was some calls that should only be targeted on those in Tier 2 areas, or, for example, those only in hospitality. We've taken the decision to make sure that the new job support scheme with its new generosity is available to all employers, all employees, wherever they are in the UK, and I think that will be of benefit to the industries and businesses that he mentioned.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's no change for people who are self-employed in this announcement. A constituent of mine has contacted me, who back in March was assessed as earning too much to qualify for any assistance. Her income has now been revised down, but there is no way for her to appeal that original decision. So this is no way to treat self-employed people. Can the Chancellor go away and look at these people who've fallen through the net?
Mr. Speaker, perhaps the honourable gentleman missed the part of the statement, for which I apologise if it wasn't clear, but we have doubled the value of the self-employed grants that will be paid in the winter from 20% to 40%, mirroring the increase in the government's support for those who are in employment and ensuring parity between self-employed and employed. But as I said, that is generous and comprehensive. With regard to the income threshold, yes, he is right. We have decided to target support for self-employed on those who earn less than £50,000. That is 95% of all those who are majority self-employed, and of those 5% who aren't included, the average income of those people is about £200,000.
Martin Vickers.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome our right honourable friend's package, and he has quite rightly adapted the support that he's given to the changing circumstances. Can I look beyond the pandemic and to the economic recovery, and could I urge continued support from my constituency in respect of the Greater Grimsby Town deal? We also need broadband connectivity, and a special mention there for the village of Well Newton, and I know he'll be disappointed if I don't also mention Freeport status for Immingham and the Humber ports.
Again. Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. It's important that we can look through this crisis to our economic recovery. I know his area will play a starring role in helping drive that recovery, whether it is Grimsby or a Freeport and Immingham. I'm pleased to say we're making good progress on the Freeport process and hope to be able to announce the bidding process very soon, and I look forward to receiving his local area's application when the time is right.
Dave Duke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The nature of the Government's interventions in this crisis are reactionary and with significant gaps in that support. A principal casualty of the gaps in that support are the 3 million excluded who have had a devastating summer, and I urge the Chancellor to advise me what support will he now give. He's used the word generous over 20 times in this statement. What support will he give to the 3 million excluded? And can he do them the service of not telling them how he supported other people? What will he do for the 3 million excluded?
Mr Speaker, everyone who is self-employed circumstance will be very different. It may well be that they own a business premises which will benefit from business rates relief, or indeed a cash grant. It may well be that they've used the bounce back loan scheme, as over 1 million small businesses have. It may be that they're benefiting from the enhanced welfare system and the improvements to universal credit and the local housing allowance. Or indeed it may be that they are the self-employed people who today will benefit from a doubling of the grant that I've announced, which will be up to over £3,700 this Christmas. This remains one of the most comprehensive packages of support for those that are self-employed anywhere in the world.
Dr Kieran Millen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On behalf of the Hot Pulp Pub in Wisterton, Hickory Smokehouse in Shavington, Piri House in Nantwich, Giovanni's in Crewe, 8 Farmers in Leighton, all of whom have been telling me about the difficulties they've been facing, I want to thank the Chancellor for the support measures he's announced today, which are going to make a huge impact on their ability to get through this troubling time. Can you confirm when this support will be available and whether it will be backdated for those of us that have been in Tier 2 for some time?
Thank you. I think if we're ending on this note, Mr Speaker, I think my honourable friend is maybe exceptionally hungry to hear that roll call of great-sounding restaurants, which I hope I have a chance to visit with him. I can gladly give him that reassurance. We'll be backdating the Tier 2 grant support to the time that those restrictions were put in place, and I hope that will be of benefit to all of the restaurants that he mentioned and many more small businesses in his constituency.
I have to notify the House, in accordance with the Royal Assent Act 1967, that Her Majesty has signified her royal assent to the following acts: Sentencing Act 2020, Extradition Provisionals Arrest Act 2020. In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order!